why did Mike McDaniel learn today? What happened in Miami that caused the Dolphins to tell Mike McDaniel he is in fact out?
So this was a product of a bunch of different discussions that have been going on for quite some time. Mike McDaniel met with Stephen Ross on Tuesday. He laid out, I was told, just a vision and the plan for where they were going to go in the future. It sounded like that meeting from McDaniel's perspective went well. He had had discussions with his coaching staff as recently as yesterday. He was doing exit interviews with players and laying out the groundwork for the offseason, detailed enough that it was, all right, Quinn Ewers, lead the throwing sessions with the skill guys in Texas during the break in the offseason. This was not a guy, Mike McDaniel, who thought he was going to come into the office today and be fired. But Stephen Ross gave it a lot of different thought. Ross had said at the end of last season that the status quo is not good enough. Certainly, Mike did everything he could down the stretch. You look at the second half of the season, I think they went 6-3. They rallied after the firing of GM Chris Greer. Miami, by the way, is in round 2 of their GM interviews. Those guys are in the building starting today. They should have a GM in place in the next day or two. But, Stephen Ross thought it over about where the team was going. He ultimately decided to go for the full organizational reset. It's not unprecedented. It is unusual to fire your head coach on a Thursday, but I would also say the events of the past several days have been unusual in many regards across the NFL. My personal belief, Rich, we talked about this on the Insiders on game day morning on this show, was that the only way that Mike McDaniel was going to be out was if the Dolphins came to the belief that they could potentially get a clear upgrade. Well, all of a sudden, you have the likes of Kevin Stefanski and then certainly John Harbaugh becoming available. This was not a linear, they've got a deal in place with John Harbaugh and he's the new coach. It's not that. In fact, I talked to Brian Harlan, John Harbaugh's agent, within the past half hour. He said he has not heard yet from the Dolphins. He's heard from the other 6 teams that had vacancies when Harbaugh was let go, but the Dolphins' plan has been hire the GM, then turn their attention to the head coach process. For Harbaugh, who certainly wants to have alignment with the GM wherever he goes, we'll see exactly how that process plays out and how that potentially might impact the chances, if any, that John Harbaugh is the next coach of the Miami Dolphins.
So this was not Harbaugh's free, let's bounce our coach and start a search. And he could still wind up, obviously, in Miami. So you're saying this was not a Harbaugh-related decision from Stephen Ross at all? What about any involvement of the new inner circle that involves a colleague at ESPN's in Troy Aikman? Tom, what about that? What are you hearing there?
Troy Aikman has been, involved with the GM search, and he was tapped a few weeks ago. Had done a lot of research in terms of, what the best people were to bring in from the best organizations across the NFL, and that's where they had it narrowed down to John Eric Sullivan, who's a highly respected executive from the Packers, Josh Williams, who's an up and comer out there, in San Francisco, Chad Alexander, who worked in Baltimore and does have a connection. He's currently the Chargers assistant GM. There is a connection there with the Harbaughs. And then Champ Kelly, the interim GM, is also one of the 4 finalists that's doing in-person interviews here. But with regard to John Harbaugh, this is not down the line right now. I know that people, may have doubts about the veracity of some of these things. And I would pump the brakes a little on this idea, that 25 different teams all called and offered John Harbaugh the job within 5 minutes of him being fired by the Ravens. There's a lot of interest. There is no doubt about that. And like I said, the other 6 teams that have head coaching vacancies have checked in some capacity on John Harbaugh, and I fully anticipate that the Dolphins, who, of course, Stephen Ross, a Michigan man who was a big fan of Jim Harbaugh but never wanted to poach the head coach from his alma mater, has a great affinity for the Harbaugh family, that, maybe there is, a connection, or there definitely is a connection there where he would be intrigued about John Harbaugh. I would also point to this. John Harbaugh is a highly accomplished coach. He has won a Super Bowl. He's also 63 years old. This is, in many ways, a young man's league. The oldest head coach in the NFC playoff field this year is Matt LaFleur. That's the makeup of head coaches right now. Of course, on the AFC side, Jim Harbaugh is in. Sean Payton, who is very similar in age to John Harbaugh, has done an unbelievable job in Denver. I'm not sitting here saying that John Harbaugh has somehow aged himself out, and the level of interest that he has certainly backs that up. But every team is going to have different criteria for what they're looking to hire, which brings us to what are the logical landing spots for John Harbaugh?
Yes, sir.
I would say this. Nothing is off the table. And again, I spoke to Brian Harlan a short time ago, John Harbaugh's agent. He told me John is taking a few days to decompress. He's getting his daughter back to college. He wants to see what all the options are and, be able to kind of think through what he wants to do next. I personally, speaking for myself, Rich, I don't see John Harbaugh as the next head coach of the Arizona Cardinals. That's not been their MO in terms of jumping out quick and paying top dollar for a top coach. Arizona's never done that. Doesn't mean they can't. I don't really see it going that direction. I don't see him as the head coach of the Las Vegas Raiders, being in a division with his brother as well as his mentor in Andy Reid. I don't see that being the fit for John Harbaugh. The places that make sense to me for John Harbaugh, Miami is certainly one, though again, John Harbaugh is going to want to have alignment, if not be able to have a strong voice in his GM. Miami right now is moving forward as if they are going to hire a GM. That's their full intention in the next day or two. Atlanta makes a lot of sense. Arthur Blank talked about it earlier today, saying they'd like to talk to John Harbaugh if he's willing to talk to them. But they are also pretty far down the line in terms of the interview process, where they're interviewing a bunch of people for this president of football job that is widely believed to be Matt Ryan's job. And then in turn, they'll hire somebody else into the general manager role. That all could be done in the next 48 hours. The other place that makes sense is the New York Giants. Joe Schoen is running that search. New York has reaffirmed its commitment to Joe Schoen. My understanding is Joe Schoen has certainly, to say the least, been recruiting John Harbaugh while also interviewing other head coaching candidates. There's all kinds of reasons that New York, at the center of this, would appear to be the logical spot for John Harbaugh. But it is not a slam dunk. It is not a done deal. This is not waiting out, them checking boxes and talking to other people. I mean, they've got other strong candidates. Kevin Stefanski was in the building. I believe Raheem Morris is there today. Antonio Pierce is going to interview tomorrow. They've got some Zoom set up with guys like Vance Joseph. And Mike McCarthy is coming in next week. I'm told that he's going to be in there Monday night, have dinner, and interview on Tuesday. If you do a blind resume, Rich, and I did this the other day,
yes,
and sent it to a few people just as a test, there are 4 coaches who were all hired between 2006 and 2008 to their first head coaching jobs. They all have one Super Bowl win. They've all won between 60 and 63% of their games, and they've all been to the playoffs either 12 or 13 times. Those 4 coaches are Sean Payton, Mike Tomlin, John Harbaugh, and Mike McCarthy. For whatever reason, Mike McCarthy's name comes up and doesn't seem to get the same massive response that John Harbaugh's did. But Mike McCarthy's also the one guy out of that group, along with Sean Payton, who is a quarterback guy, who has worked with him. I think that Mike McCarthy is a completely logical fit for what New York wants to do. So let's see how these processes roll out. There will be nothing precluding the Giants by even this weekend of hiring a head coach. But again, when I asked Brian Harlan, he said absolutely not going to be, all right, they check the Rooney Rule boxes and they just hired John on Saturday. That's not going to happen. Potentially, they'll regroup over the weekend. He could take one visit. He could take 2 or 3. This might be like an old school coaching search, Rich, 20, 30 years ago, where it was, all right, you order those top 3 teams, and if you take the first visit and you don't get a deal done with him,
see ya.
He's out of the building. He's going someplace else. This could set up that way for John Harbaugh. Nothing is set right now. Nothing is scheduled. But that first team could be the New York Giants. We're just going to have to see exactly how this plays out.
Hey, you made it all the way to the end. Thanks for that. Check us out every single day streaming live on Disney Plus and the ESPN app 12 to 3 Eastern.